For Patrick O'Connell, a man living on the edge of a wilderness that mirrored his own grief, the sound that tore through the raging storm wasn't thunder. It was a cry of pure panic, a sound that would force him to choose between his own safety and the life of a creature whose mother could end his in an instant. He made that choice, plunging into the icy torrent of the Skycomish River. But what happened days later was not the vengeful attack he feared. It was an encounter so unbelievable it would challenge everything he thought he knew about the boundary between man and nature, and deliver a message from a world he believed he had lost forever. The rain didn't just fall, it assaulted. It hammered the cedar shingles of Patrick O'Connell's cabin, turning the world outside his window into a churning, impressionistic blur of green and gray. The Skycomish River, usually a placid, meandering ribbon of silver, had swollen into a furious brown beast, tearing at its banks and swallowing whole the smooth gray stones where he often sat to think. Patrick, a man whose face was a roadmap of 57 years etched with laughter and loss in equal measure, watched the tempest from his worn leather armchair. A mug of lukewarm coffee sat untouched beside him. For 2 years, since Sarah had passed, this cabin had been his fortress against a world that had lost its color. He had been a wildlife photographer, a man who spoke the language of patience and light. Sarah, a botanist, had spoken the language of soil and seasons. Together, they had understood the forest. Now, he was just a man with a ghost, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper her name in the wind. The storm was a fitting backdrop for his mood, chaotic, powerful, and indifferent. He tracked the frantic dance of a waterlogged maple leaf as it was sucked into the river's main current. That's what grief felt like, he mused, being pulled into an undertow you couldn't fight, a force that just carried you away from the life you knew. It was then that he heard it. It wasn't the roar of the river or the percussive drumming of the rain. It was a sound that sliced through the din with the sharp edge of desperation, a high-pitched, frantic bleating that was utterly out of place. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Patrick straightened in his chair, his old instincts kicking in. His ears, trained by decades of listening for the snap of a twig or the distant call of a hawk, isolated the sound. It was an animal, a young one by the sound of it, and it was in the river. He grabbed his heavy-duty rain slicker from the peg by the door, jamming his feet into worn rubber boots. The thought of what he was doing barely registered. That sound of primal fear had bypassed his brain and gone straight to his heart. As he wrenched the door open, the wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the cabin wall. The full force of the storm hit him, a wall of water and sound. He leaned into the gale, his eyes squinting against the deluge as he scanned the raging river. The water was a chaotic mess of churning rapids and debris. Branches, leaves, even a small log tumbled end over end in the violent current. Then he saw it, a small, dark head barely visible above the frothing water, its mouth open in that heartbreaking cry. A bear cub. And it was losing its fight. Patrick's blood ran cold. Every rational thought, every piece of knowledge he'd accumulated over a lifetime in the wild, screamed at him, where there is a cub, there is a mother. And a mother bear, especially a grizzly facing a threat to her cub, is not an animal, it is a force of nature, as deadly and unforgiving as the river itself. He scanned the opposite bank, a dense wall of ancient firs and dripping ferns. He saw nothing, but that meant nothing. She could be anywhere, watching. He knew the protocol: you don't interfere. You never, ever get between a mother and her young. It was the first rule of the wilderness, a rule written in the blood of those who had foolishly ignored it. The cub cried out again, a weaker, gurgling sound this time. It was going under. In that instant, the protocol, the rules, the fear of the mother, it all evaporated. He saw only a terrified baby drowning in a monster's maw. He saw Sarah, her hand in his, telling him once that the greatest courage was to act with compassion when logic screamed for self-preservation. Damn it all, he muttered to the wind, and began to run. He scrambled down the slick, muddy embankment, his boots sinking into the saturated earth. The river's edge was a maelstrom. The cold of the waters was a physical shock as it surged past his knees, pulling at him with incredible force. He fixed his eyes on the cub, which was now about 30 feet out, being swept downstream at an alarming rate. He pushed forward, leaning his weight against the current. The water was up to his waist, numbing his legs, its power terrifying. A large branch slammed into his side, knocking the wind out of him and nearly sending him under. He gasped, spitting out gritty river water, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was madness, utter, suicidal madness. He could see the cub more clearly now. It was tiny, its fur matted and dark with water. Its paws were flailing uselessly, its eyes wide with a terror that Patrick felt in the pit of his own stomach. He pushed on, the river now at his chest, stealing his breath. He was a strong swimmer, but this wasn't swimming, it was a brawl with a liquid giant. He finally reached the cub, grabbing a fistful of scruff on the back of its neck just as its head slipped below the surface. He hauled it up. The cub was heavier than it looked, a dead weight of water and fur. It coughed and sputtered, its tiny claws scratching weakly at his arm. Now came the harder part, getting back. Turning his body to shield the cub from the main force of the current, he began the arduous journey back to the bank. Every step was a battle. His legs were numb, his arms ached from the cold and the weight. The river seemed to claw at him, trying to reclaim its prize. He kept his eyes locked on his cabin, a tiny beacon of safety in the swirling chaos. He didn't dare look at the opposite bank, he didn't want to see her. He could feel her eyes on him, a burning, terrifying presence he could sense in his very bones. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his boots found purchase on the muddy slope of the bank. He scrambled the last few feet, collapsing onto the sodden ground, his lungs burning, the tiny bear cub held tight against his chest. He lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, the rain pounding down on him. The cub trembled violently, a low, terrified whimper vibrating through its small body. It was alive. He had done it. Slowly, shakily, he got to his feet. He had to get out of the open. He carried the cub to a small natural shelter formed by the roots of a massive fallen cedar, a place that offered some protection from the relentless downpour. He gently set the cub down on a bed of dry pine needles deep within the hollow. The little bear huddled into a miserable ball, shivering uncontrollably, its eyes small and black and shiny, never left him. There was no aggression in them, only utter fear. Patrick's heart ached for it. He knew what he had to do next, and it was the hardest thing of all. He had to leave. The mother would never approach with him here. His scent was now all over her baby, a contamination that could have unpredictable consequences. He had to retreat, to vanish, and to pray that the mother's instinct to find her child was stronger than her fear of the human who had intervened. He backed away slowly, his eyes still on the shivering cub. "She'll come for you, little one," he whispered, his voice quiet. "Your mama will come." He made his way back to his cabin, his body screaming with cold and exhaustion. He shut the door, leaning against it, his breath fogging in the cool air of the room. He was soaked to the bone, chilled and trembling, but a strange warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in 2 years, the suffocating silence of his grief had been broken, not by a human voice, but by the cry of a creature he had pulled from the jaws of death. He stripped off his wet clothes, wrapped himself in a thick wool blanket, and poured a generous measure of whiskey into a glass. His hands still shook as he raised it to his lips. He walked to the window, the one overlooking the river, and peered through the rain-streaked glass towards the fallen cedar. He waited. He watched. And he felt a profound and terrifying certainty that this was far from over. He had broken a sacred rule of the wild, and in the wild, rules weren't broken without consequences. The storm broke just before dawn, its fury dissolving into a bruised purple quiet. The world that emerged was one washed clean and deceptively calm. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, striking a billion droplets and making the forest glitter as if it had been strewn with diamonds. The Skykomish River, though still a formidable, churning torrent of muddy water, had lost its murderous rage. It had settled into a powerful, steady surge, a bass note rumbling under the symphony of birdsong that tentatively returned to the trees. Patrick hadn't slept. Sleep had been impossible. He'd spent the night in his armchair, a sentinel fueled by adrenaline and whiskey. His body aching with a profound, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Every muscle protested the brawl with the river. He had changed into dry clothes, wrapped himself in wool blankets, but the cold from the Skykomish seemed to have seeped into his marrow. His gaze remained fixed on the hollow of the fallen cedar across the clearing, a dark, silent void in the landscape. He replayed the rescue over and over, the feeling of the cub's frantic, weak struggling against his chest, the sheer terrifying power of the water. With the first true light of day, he saw it, the hollow was empty. A wave of relief so potent it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He let his head fall back against the worn leather of the chair, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lips. She had come. The mother had found her cub in the darkest hours of the night, while he had been keeping his vigil. A silent, primal reunion had taken place. He had done the right thing. He had meddled, and for once, the delicate machinery of the wild had not broken. It had bent and then reset itself. He allowed himself a small, weary smile. He had gambled against the odds and won. The incident was over. He was profoundly wrong. The incident was just beginning. For 2 days, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Patrick moved stiffly, his body slowly recovering, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. The oppressive silence of his grief had been punctured. He found himself noticing things again, the cheerful industry of a woodpecker, the sweet, resinous scent of the pines after the rain. He felt a flicker of the man he used to be, the observer who found joy in the small, intricate details of the world. He told himself the bear and her cub were long gone, miles away in the deep wilderness, the memory of him already fading from their wild consciousness. The first sign that his peace was built on a delusion came on the 3rd day. Patrick was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe a comforting, familiar metronome for his thoughts. The physical exertion felt good, chasing away the last of the river's chill. He paused, embedding the axe in the chopping block, and reached for a cloth to wipe the sweat from his brow. He happened to glance towards the dense treeline at the edge of his property, the wall of shadow and green that marked the end of his small patch of civilization. And there she was. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a full-grown female grizzly, her coat the color of dark honey, rippling with a power that seemed to hum in the air. She wasn't just big, she was a part of the landscape, a living, breathing piece of the ancient forest made manifest. She stood perfectly still, partially obscured by the deep shadows of the firs, her head raised, her nostrils testing the air. And she was watching him. Patrick's heart, which had been beating in a steady rhythm with the axe blows, leaped into his throat and stayed there, a frantic, trapped bird. The axe suddenly felt flimsy and useless in his hands. This was no chance encounter. Her posture was deliberate, her gaze unwavering. It was a stare that contained no discernible emotion, not anger, not curiosity, just an intense, unnerving, and deeply intelligent focus. He had been a wildlife photographer for over 30 years, he knew how to read animals. He understood the flicker of fear in a deer's eye, the aggressive posture of a cornered coyote. But this gaze was impenetrable, a deep, dark well of thought he could not fathom. He forced himself to remain calm, to move with a slowness that felt unnatural. He let his hands fall to his sides, leaving the axe where it was. He avoided direct eye contact, which could be seen as a challenge, instead looking slightly to her left. He spoke in a low, steady monotone, the way he used to speak to Sarah when she was lost in the depths of her illness, a voice meant to soothe both the listener and the speaker. "It's okay," he murmured, the words feeling small in the vast quiet. "I'm not a threat. I helped your little one. I mean you no harm." The bear made no move. Her ears didn't twitch, her head didn't turn. She just watched, absorbing him. After a long, tense minute that stretched into an eternity, she turned with a surprising, fluid grace and melted back into the forest. She didn't run, she simply vanished. One moment, a solid, powerful presence, the next, a memory swallowed by the shadows. Patrick let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his lungs burning. His hands were trembling again. This wasn't a thank you. This wasn't a threat. This was a statement: I am here. I know who you are. I have not forgotten. The visitations became a pattern, a ritual he could neither predict nor prevent. She was never in the same place twice, but he would see her every day, a glimpse of her massive form moving through the trees as he walked his property line, the sight of her powerful silhouette on the ridge above his cabin at dusk, a dark, primordial shape against the fading orange sky. Sometimes he wouldn't see her at all, but he would find her tracks, enormous, claw-tipped prints pressed deep into the mud near his woodshed or by the riverbank, far closer to his cabin than any bear should ever venture. He would touch the edge of the print, feeling the damp earth, a tangible link to his silent observer. She was haunting him, a silent, furry ghost tethered to his home. The initial sharp fear began to morph into a kind of chronic, low-grade anxiety. He found himself constantly scanning the woods, his senses on high alert, listening for the snap of a twig over the sound of his own heartbeat. The peaceful solitude he had once cherished in the cabin now felt like a vulnerable, exposed isolation. The forest was no longer his sanctuary, it was her territory, and he was living in it on her terms. News in a small town like Cedar Creek travels on the wind. His neighbor, a retired logger named Gus, whose property bordered the national forest a half-mile away, had seen Patrick's mad dash to the river during the storm from his kitchen window. The story, embellished with each telling, had made its way to the town's small grocery store, its single gas station, and eventually to the ears of Sheriff Frank Brody. Brody's patrol car crunched up the gravel of Patrick's driveway a week after the rescue. Brody was a man built on pragmatism and county regulations. He was younger than Patrick, with a stern, tired face that had seen too many domestic disputes and logging accidents. He carried the weight of his community's safety on his shoulders, and it had carved permanent lines of concern around his eyes. "Patrick," he said, getting out of the car and adjusting his belt in a familiar gesture. "Got a minute?" "Always, Frank," Patrick replied, leaning against the porch railing, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "Folks are talking," Brody said, getting straight to the point. His gaze swept the treeline as he spoke. "They say you pulled a bear cub out of the Skycomish." "The river was trying to kill it," Patrick said simply. There was no other explanation needed. Brody sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I get it. You're a good man, always have been. But you and I both know the saying, a fed bear is a dead bear. And a saved bear?" He shook his head. "That's a new one. But it's a bear that's now lost its fear of humans. That's a dangerous thing, Patrick, for you, for your neighbors, and ultimately for the bear." "She's been around," Patrick admitted, his voice low. There was no point in hiding it, Brody would find out sooner or later. Brody's eyes sharpened, his focus snapping back to Patrick. "How around? How close?" "Treeline, mostly. Found tracks near the shed this morning." The sheriff swore under his breath, a soft, frustrated sound. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. She's associating you with her cub. That's a powerful, unpredictable bond. She might see you as a threat she needs to neutralize, or hell, I don't know what she's thinking, but it's not good. Fish and wildlife will have to be notified. They'll likely have to trap her, relocate her and the cub. If she becomes aggressive, if she so much as bluffs a charge at Gus's dog, they'll have to put her down." Patrick's stomach clenched into a cold, hard knot. Put her down. The thought was sickening. This magnificent wild creature who had done nothing but watch him, condemned because he had shown a moment of compassion. "No. Don't do that, Frank. Not yet. She's not been aggressive. Not once. She's just watching." "Watching is how it starts," Brody countered, his voice firm with the authority of his office. "It's a half step away from habituation. Next, she's on your porch, sniffing around your trash, then her cub learns the same behavior. It never, ever ends well, Patrick. I'm giving you an official warning. Be careful. And if she gets any closer, if her behavior changes in any way, you call me. You don't hesitate. Understood?" "Understood," Patrick said, though a knot of defiance was tightening in his gut. After Brody left, a trail of dust settling behind his car, Patrick felt a shift inside him. The fear was still there, a cold companion in the quiet of the cabin, but now it was mixed with a fierce protective instinct he hadn't felt for anyone or anything since Sarah. He had saved the cub, in a way, he felt responsible for the mother too. He had meddled in their lives, and calling in the authorities felt like a profound betrayal of that act. He went inside and opened a long-neglected trunk at the foot of his bed. The scent of cedar and thyme wafted out. He dug out his old professional camera, a heavy Nikon D4 with a powerful 200 to 500 mm telephoto lens that he hadn't touched since Sarah's diagnosis. His hands felt clumsy on the familiar controls at first, the intricate dials and buttons alien, but soon the muscle memory returned, a ghost of his former life flowing back into his fingertips. He cleaned the lens with a soft cloth, his movements slow and deliberate. The weight of the camera in his hands was comforting, real. If this bear was going to be his warden, he would be her historian. He began to document her. He gave her a name, Ka, a name he'd heard once that meant wise child. It seemed to fit her silent, knowing presence. From the safety of his cabin window, he photographed her. He learned to anticipate her appearances, to read the subtle signs in the forest that heralded her arrival. Through the powerful lens, he could see her in stunning detail. He captured the intelligence in her dark, watchful eyes, the way the sunlight caught the silver tips of her fur, the scars on her snout that told of a life of struggle and survival. He started the journal again, in earnest. He noted the times of her appearances, her location, her behavior. He realized she never brought the cub with her on these vigils. She was keeping it safe, hidden away while she conducted her strange surveillance. And he saw she wasn't just randomly appearing, there was a logic to it, a terrifying intelligence. She would appear when he was engaged in loud, distinctly human activities, splitting wood, working on his truck's engine, even just talking on the phone on his porch. It was as if she was studying him, learning his patterns, his sounds, his very essence. One afternoon, she came closer than ever before. She walked out of the forest and sat at the edge of the clearing, 100 yards from his cabin. She sat not like a predator, but like an elder sitting for a council, her massive head held high. For an hour, she simply sat there, watching the cabin. Patrick watched her back through his lens, his finger hovering over the shutter button, his breathing shallow. He zoomed in on her face, the lens bringing her impossibly close. Her expression was placid, her ears relaxed. This wasn't the posture of an aggressive or fearful animal. It was something else entirely, something he had never witnessed in all his years. It was contemplation. He was no longer just the observed, he was being studied, assessed, perhaps even judged. The line between man and beast, between rescuer and potential threat, was becoming increasingly blurred. He was caught in a silent, patient dialogue with a creature whose language he was only just beginning to understand. And he had the terrifying, exhilarating feeling that she was about to speak. The standoff, this strange, silent conversation between man and bear, continued into the next week. The forest around Patrick's cabin no longer felt empty or lonely, it felt charged, alive with a singular, powerful presence. Ka had become a part of his daily rhythm, a wild and unpredictable variable in a life that had become static with grief. He'd wake up before the sun, and his first act would be to scan the tree line from his window, a fresh mug of coffee steaming in his hands. His last act at night before surrendering to a restless sleep would be the same. The raw fear hadn't vanished, it was a cold, primal companion that lived in the base of his skull. But it had been joined by a profound, almost obsessive curiosity. He was a photographer again, not just in action, but in spirit. He was seeing the world, her world, with an intensity he thought had died with Sarah. His old Nikon became a permanent extension of his arm. He documented her with the patience of a naturalist and the soul of an artist. He captured the subtle shifts in her posture, the way her ears would pivot to catch a distant sound, the sheer breathtaking power in the bulge of her shoulder muscles as she moved through the undergrowth with impossible grace. He filled pages in his journal, the one he hadn't touched in 2 years, with sketches of her tracks, notes on the wind direction during her appearances, and his own swirling thoughts. "She never brings the cub," he wrote one evening, the nib of his pen scratching in the quiet cabin. "She keeps it hidden. Is her surveillance of me a defensive measure? Is she assessing the threat I pose to her young? Or is it something else? Her gaze doesn't feel hostile. It feels analytical, as if I am a puzzle she is patiently trying to solve." While Patrick was becoming absorbed in this intricate mystery, the town of Cedar Creek was growing restless. His mad dash into the river was one thing, a moment of reckless heroism. But this ongoing communion with a grizzly bear was another matter entirely. It unnerved people. It felt like a violation of an unspoken pact between the town and the wilderness that surrounded it, a line that was not meant to be crossed. Sheriff Frank Brody had been true to his word. The informal call he'd made to the regional fish and wildlife department had put Patrick on the clock. Brody's patrol car crunched up the gravel driveway again 10 days after the rescue, and this time the sheriff didn't look tired, he looked grim. "I spoke with Dr. Evans," Brody said, leaning against his car, foregoing any pleasantries. "He's the head biologist for this region. He says the bear is exhibiting classic Level 2 habituation. Level 1 is a bear that sees a human and bolts. Level 2 is a bear that shows no fear, holds its ground, and observes. It's a dangerous precursor, Patrick." "She's not aggressive, Frank," Patrick insisted, his voice low. "You have to believe me. She's just watching." "That's what they all say, right up until the moment it's too late," Brody countered, his voice sharp with frustration. "Evans says Level 2 inevitably leads to Level 3, approaching human dwellings, seeking food, destroying property. Once she hits Level 3, our hands are tied. It's called the Predator Management Protocol. It's for public safety, and it's not a negotiation." The word management was a cold, sterile euphemism that made Patrick's stomach clench. It was a bureaucratic stamp on a death sentence. Brody sighed, the anger draining from his face, leaving only weariness behind. "Look, Patrick, I'm on your side here, but I've got the whole town breathing down my neck. Gus saw her tracks just 50 yards from his property line. The department has given me a deadline. You've got a few more days. If her behavior doesn't change, if she doesn't move on her own and disappear back into the deep woods where she belongs, I have to make the official report. They'll come out. They'll set a trap, and they'll take her away. And if she resists?" He didn't need to finish the sentence. A deadline. Now there was a deadline on Kaw's life, and on Finn's by extension. The weight of it settled on Patrick, heavier than any grief he had known. He had meddled with the natural order to save a life, and it seemed his reward would be to condemn another. The change came the next morning. The air was cool and damp, the sky a blanket of uniform gray. Patrick was on his porch, the untouched journal in his lap, when Kaw emerged from the woods. This time, she didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. With a calm, deliberate gait that bespoke utter confidence, she walked about 20 yards closer, into the open space between the forest and his cabin. She dropped something from her mouth onto the dew-wet grass. It was a large salmon, its silver scales still iridescent, clearly fresh from the river. She looked at him, a long, steady gaze that seemed to pin him to his chair, then turned with that liquid grace and walked back to the woods. Patrick stared, dumbfounded. His heart hammered against his ribs. A gift. Bears were known to cache prey, but this was different. The placement. The direct eye contact. The sheer intentionality of the act. It felt like a message. He didn't touch the fish, he knew better than to take food from a predator. It would only escalate the habituation. But he sketched the scene in his journal, his hand shaking slightly. An offering? A test? Is she thanking me, or is this a display of her power as a provider? A warning not to be trifled with. The next day, it happened again. In the same spot, she deposited a large branch heavy with ripe purple huckleberries, a prize of the late summer forest. Again, she watched him for a long moment, then retreated. The act was so gentle, so contrary to her immense power, that it brought a lump to Patrick's throat. He felt compelled to respond. He stood on his porch, his voice low and earnest, feeling foolish but needing to try. "I see you, Ka. I see what you're doing. It's beautiful. But you can't stay. You don't understand. They're going to hurt you if you stay. You have to take your boy and go deep into the mountains." She, of course, gave no reply but the silent testament of her presence. It was as if she was trying to communicate in the only way she knew how, using the language of her world, the currency of the river and the forest. She was showing him her provisions, her life. But in her attempt to communicate, she was sealing her own fate. Her gifts were level 3 habituation, plain and simple. She was approaching, leaving items. She had crossed the line. The clock was ticking, loud and menacing. On the final day of Brody's unofficial ultimatum, the air was thick with a dreadful, final tension. Patrick felt a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. He hadn't seen Ka all morning, and her absence was somehow more unnerving than her presence had ever been. He paced the length of his cabin, the Nikon sitting heavy on the table. He considered calling Brody himself, admitting defeat. Maybe a relocation was the best he could hope for. It was better than the alternative. He hadn't seen Ka all morning, and her absence was somehow more unnerving than her presence had ever been. He paced the length of his cabin, the Nikon sitting heavy on the table. He considered calling Brody himself, admitting defeat. Maybe a relocation was the best he could hope for. It was better than the alternative. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and soft, dying rose, he saw her. She emerged from the woods, but this time was different. This time, she was not alone. Trotting behind her, sticking so close to her massive legs that he was almost invisible, was the cub. He was healthy, his fur thick and fuzzy, and he moved with a clumsy, youthful energy that was breathtaking to behold. He was perfect. Patrick's heart swelled at the sight of him. Finn. Ka led Finn not to the edge of the woods, but to the very center of the clearing. Then she did something that stopped Patrick's breath. She lay down, a full, deliberate prostration on the damp grass, the ultimate signal of non-aggression. With her snout, she nudged the cub forward. Finn, hesitant at first, took a few tentative steps toward the alien structure of the cabin, looked back at his mother for reassurance, and then continued, his curiosity overriding his fear. This was it. The moment of truth. Patrick's mind raced, a torrent of conflicting fears and wonders. Was this a threat? Was she showing him what he had almost lost, what she could still defend with lethal force? He remained perfectly still on his porch, his hands gripping the weathered wooden railing so tightly his knuckles were white. The cub, emboldened, trotted all the way to the foot of the 3 wooden steps leading to the porch. He sniffed the air, his little nose twitching. He looked up at Patrick with the same shiny, black bead eyes he remembered from the river, eyes filled not with terror this time, but with an innocent inquisitiveness. Then Ka made a low sound, a soft grunt. It wasn't a command, but a call. She rose to her feet and, instead of leaving, she walked toward the porch herself. This was the ultimate transgression. Every alarm bell in Patrick's head was screaming. This was the moment that would get her killed. He wanted to shout, to scare her away, to throw something, anything, to break the spell and save her from herself. But he was paralyzed, caught in the grip of a moment so surreal, so sacred, it felt like a dream. She stopped about 10 feet from the steps, the cub now safely behind her. She was impossibly large up close, a mountain of fur and power and ancient wisdom. He could hear her soft, rhythmic breathing, a sound like the gentle bellows of a forge. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw no malice, no challenge. He saw an intelligence so deep and searching it humbled him to his very core. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her great head. She opened her mouth and, with a gentleness that defied her size and strength, she placed something on the ground. It wasn't a fish or a branch of berries. It was small, and it glinted in the last rays of the setting sun. It was metal. She looked at him one last time, a long, deep, and undecipherable look that felt like a chapter closing. She grunted softly to Finn, and together they turned and walked back across the clearing, melting into the deepening shadows of the forest as if they had never been there at all. Patrick stood frozen for a full minute, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The world seemed to rush back in, the chirping of crickets, the sigh of the wind in the pines. He slowly descended the steps, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. He knelt on the damp grass, his eyes fixed on the object. It was a locket, a silver, heart-shaped locket, tarnished by years in the earth, but unmistakably familiar. His breath hitched in his throat. With a trembling finger, he picked it up. It was cold and heavy in his palm. He brushed away the grime from the front with his thumb, his touch reverent. He could just make out the faint, swirling engraving, P+S forever. A sob escaped him, a raw, guttural sound torn from the very depths of his soul. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers clumsy and numb. It sprang open. Inside, miraculously protected from the years of soil and rain, were two tiny, faded photographs. On the left, a much younger version of himself, his hair dark, his smile wide and unburdened by the years. On the right, his Sarah, her head thrown back in laughter, her eyes sparkling with the life and love he missed so desperately. It was a constant physical ache. Sarah's locket, the one he had given her on their 5th anniversary. She had lost it on one of her research hikes deep in the national forest, not far from here. They had searched for days, crawling on their hands and knees, but it was gone, swallowed by the wilderness. She had been heartbroken. He sank to his knees, clutching the locket to his chest. The tears he had held back for 2 years finally breaking free. They streamed down his weathered cheeks, hot and cleansing, washing away the dust of his sorrow. Ka hadn't been stalking him. She hadn't been thanking him with fish and berries. She had been trying to understand him, to identify him. That day in the river, his scent, the scent of the man who had held her child, had become imprinted in her memory. And somewhere in her territory, in the deep, dark earth near her den, she had unearthed an object that carried that same strange, foundational scent, his scent. Sarah's scent. The scent of their shared life. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a thank you. It was something far more profound. It was an act of recognition, a returning of something lost, a communication that transcended the barrier of species. A message sent from the heart of the wild. She was telling him, I know you. This is yours. You are part of this place, just as I am. In that moment, under the stardust canopy of the forest, the grieving photographer and the wild mother bear were not two separate beings from different worlds. They were connected by a shared moment of desperation in a raging river and a shared understanding of love and loss, symbolized by a small silver heart returned from the dead. Patrick didn't sleep. The night passed in a state of suspended reality, the world outside his window held in a silent, stardust hush. He sat in his worn leather armchair, the cabin's familiar shadows dancing in the dying firelight, and held the silver locket in the cup of his hands. It was still cold from the night air, but a phantom warmth seemed to pulse from it, a ghost of the life it had once known. He didn't dare open it again. The image of Sarah, young and laughing, was seared into his mind's eye. To look again felt like it might break the spell, shatter the fragile, impossible truth of its return. Grief, he'd learned, was a thief that took more than just a person. It stole the future. But it also poisoned the past, turning cherished memories into painful reminders of what was lost. For 2 years, he had been a man haunted by yesterday. But holding this solid piece of that yesterday, miraculously returned from the earth, felt different. It was not a ghost, it was an anchor. And for the first time, it felt like it might moor him to the present instead of dragging him into the depths of the past. When the first pale fingers of dawn stroked the sky, illuminating the dew on the grass where she had stood, he knew what he had to do. There was no grand revelation, only a quiet, resolute certainty that settled in his bones. This story was not his alone. He drove into town with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The silver locket was warm in his shirt pocket, resting against his chest like a second, smaller heart. The familiar road to Cedar Creek seemed new, transformed by the night's events. The towering firs weren't just trees, they were silent witnesses. The Skycomish River, now calm and glinting in the morning sun, wasn't a threat, it was a place of connection, a baptismal font where 2 worlds had collided. He didn't stop at the grocery store or the post office, the mundane errands of life could wait. He drove straight to the sheriff's station, a small, unassuming brick building that represented the town's attempt to impose order on a world that was fundamentally wild. Frank Brody was at his desk, buried in paperwork, a look of weary resignation etched onto his face. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. He looked up as Patrick entered, and his expression immediately tightened, his shoulders tensed. Preparing for the inevitable bad news he was sure Patrick was there to deliver. "Patrick," he said, his tone cautious, his hand already moving toward a notepad. "Everything all right? Did she come back? Is there a problem?" Patrick didn't say a word. Words felt inadequate, too small for the story he carried. He simply walked to the desk, past the photos of Brody's smiling kids and the official county seal, and took the locket from his pocket. He placed it gently on a stack of files, the small metallic object looking profoundly out of place amidst the bureaucracy. With a steady finger, he opened the clasp, revealing the 2 tiny, faded portraits within. Brody stared. He leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the tarnished silver and the faint, swirling engravings. He'd been to Patrick and Sarah's home for barbecues in the old days, before life had gotten so complicated. He remembered Sarah, her hands always covered in a light dusting of soil, her face animated as she talked about her work. And he remembered the story of the lost locket, a small, sharp tragedy in a life that would later be visited by a much larger one. "My God," Brody whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. He looked from the locket to Patrick's weathered face and back again. That's Sarah's locket. Where in the hell did you find it? I thought that thing was gone for good." "I didn't find it," Patrick said, his voice quiet but steady, resonating with a strange power in the still office. "It was brought to me." Brody looked confused, his mind grasping for a logical explanation. "Brought to you? What do you mean?" "Ka," Patrick said. The name hung in the air between them. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, a slow-motion recoil, a flicker of disbelief, then bewilderment, then outright concern crossing his face. He looked at Patrick as if he'd finally cracked, as if the grief and isolation had finally eroded his sanity. You mean the bear? Patrick, that's... He trailed off, searching for a word that wasn't insane. Impossible, is it? Patrick asked. And he told him everything. He recounted the events of the previous evening, the strange, ritualistic gifts of the salmon and the huckleberries, the deliberate, controlled arrival of Ka with her healthy cub, the heart-stopping moment she had walked toward him, and the unbelievable gentleness with which she had deposited the locket at his feet. He spoke with a simple, unadorned honesty that was impossible to dismiss, the quiet conviction of a man who has witnessed a miracle. Brody was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the locket. He was a man who dealt in facts, in evidence, in the predictable and often unpleasant realities of human behavior. His world was one of cause and effect, of rules and consequences. What Patrick was describing belonged to a different realm, one of folklore and myth. But the evidence was right there, sitting on his desk, a tangible piece of the past, an object lost to the wilderness for nearly a decade, returned. He reached out a hesitant hand and picked it up, holding it carefully in his palm. "She brought you this," Brody said, more to himself than to Patrick, the words a soft murmur of dawning wonder. "She must have found it near her den, smelled you on it, or Sarah, and connected it to you after the rescue." He shook his head slowly, a slow, profound amazement replacing the skepticism in his eyes. "I'll be damned." He looked up at Patrick, and for the first time, the stern, professional mask of the sheriff was gone. In its place was just Frank, the man who had known Patrick and Sarah for years, the neighbor who had mourned with the whole town. "The protocol, the regulations, they don't have a box to check for this, Patrick. There's no procedure for a bear returning lost property." With a newfound resolve, he reached for the phone. Patrick could only hear Brody's side of the conversation with Dr. Evans at Fish and Wildlife, a master class in bureaucratic navigation. "Bill, Frank Brody down in Cedar Creek." "Yeah, it's about that bear, the O'Connell case." "Look, something has happened, you're not going to believe it." "Yes, I'm sure." "No, he's not crazy, and I haven't been drinking. I'm holding it in my hand right now. It's a piece of jewelry, a locket. It belonged to his wife. She lost it 10 years ago up on Eagle Ridge." "How did he get it?" "That's what I'm trying to tell you." "The bear." "Yes, Bill, the bear. She brought it to him last night. Look, I can't explain it, but it happened. We're standing down. The case is closed." When he hung up the phone, the station was quiet but for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Brody looked at Patrick, a small, wry smile playing on his lips. "They think you're a local eccentric and that I'm covering for you, but they agreed to classify the bear as non-threatening territory established. They won't be trapping her. She's safe." A wave of gratitude washed over Patrick, so immense it left him speechless. He simply nodded, his eyes conveying the thanks his voice could not. The story of the locket spread through Cedar Creek, but not in the way the gossip about the crazy bear man had. This was different. It was told in quieter tones, over coffee at the diner, over fences between neighbors. It transformed from gossip into something more respectful, more wondrous. It became a local legend, a piece of the town's modern folklore, a story that reminded people that the world was bigger and more mysterious than they sometimes thought. Patrick became a figure of quiet wonder, a man who had touched the wild in a way no one else had. Life at the cabin changed. The tension that had kept him a prisoner was gone, replaced by a sense of deep, abiding peace he hadn't realized was possible. Ka and Finn did not become pets. They did not come for daily visits. The relationship that had been forged was one of profound mutual respect, built on distance, not proximity. He would see them sometimes, a flash of honey-colored fur at the far end of the clearing, or a glimpse of them by the riverbank downstream, Finn wrestling with a branch under his mother's watchful eye. Ka would occasionally look his way, a long, placid gaze that felt not like a stare-down, but an acknowledgement, a greeting between neighbors who understood the boundaries of their shared home. Patrick picked up his camera, not as an escape from his grief, but as a passion reborn from its ashes. He didn't just photograph Ka and Finn, he photographed the world around him with new eyes, Sarah's eyes. He saw the intricate, fractal patterns of moss on a fallen log, the fierce, desperate determination of a single salmon fighting its way upstream, the gentle, ancient sway of the cedars in the wind. He saw it all as part of one vast, interconnected story, a story of struggle, survival, and unexpected grace. He saw Sarah not as a painful absence, but as a living part of that story, her memory and her love woven into the very fabric of the forest she had so adored. The locket sat on the mantelpiece next to a framed photo of Sarah. It was more than a piece of jewelry, it was a compass. But it had been returned to him not to point him back to the past and the grief that had anchored him there, but to point him forward, toward a future where wonder was still possible. He had gone to the river to save a life, thinking it was the cub's. But in the end, 2 lives had been saved, a small bear cub pulled from a raging current, and a man pulled from a silent storm of his own, brought back to shore by the unbelievable, untamable, and profoundly beautiful heart of the wild. Patrick's story is a powerful testament that the connections we share with the natural world are far deeper and more mysterious than we can ever truly comprehend. It wasn't just about saving a bear cub, it was about an act of compassion that was returned in a way that healed a wounded heart and bridged the gap between 2 worlds. It reminds us that grief, love, and recognition are not solely human experiences, and that the wilderness holds wisdom for those willing to listen. If this story of an unbreakable bond moved you, please show your support by giving this video a like. Let us know in the comments what you think about this incredible encounter. Share this video with someone who appreciates the profound mysteries of the animal kingdom, and most importantly, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next story exploring the incredible connections that bind us all. Thank you for watching.